I'm going to call this meeting to order of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization's TIP Project Cost Ad Hoc Committee. I'm going to read the guidelines, the virtual meeting guidelines. So all participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. Participants can mute and unmute themselves. To participate in the discussion, please use the raised hand function. You can find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a little raised hand, or sometimes it's the reactions button in the toolbar, and either myself or one of the CTPS staff will call on you. If you are on the phone, you can also use *9 to raise your hand. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please contact Kate White. You can do that via the chat box. You can email her at kwhite@ctps.org, or you can call her at 857-702-3658. This meeting is being recorded. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions to the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards, and Revive Section 508 standards. Again, if you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Kate White, NPO staff, at kwhite@ctps.org or 857-702-3658. So I'm going to do, we're going to do introductions and sort of a roll call. So I'm Eric Barassa. I'm the Director of Transportation with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And I'm just going to call a roll. So is John Romano here from MassDOT Highway? Doesn't sound like it.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, you're here.
You hear me?
Great.
Sorry,
Yep.
I was trying to unmute.
Thank you, John. Is Brian Kane here from the advisory board?
Here we go.
Oh, I think I see him. Brian, are you in the meeting now?
He's just joining, Eric. So
I'll come back to him.
Yeah.
Len Diggins from Artec.
Yes, Len Diggins from the advisory council.
Great. Jim Fitzgerald from the city of Boston. Okay, don't see Jim. Jay Monty from Everett. Is Jay here? Okay. What about
Jay is here.
Jay's here?
Yeah, just a reminder, everyone, you can control your mute and unmuting.
Okay, I'm here. Yep, sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, see, I'm like, I'm looking at like a Word document, so I have the thing closed. Is Peter Pelletier here from SWAP, from the town of Medway? No, Peter Pelletier. What about Tom Bent from the city of Somerville? No Tom. And Jen Constable from the town of Rockland? Okay, let me just go back. Brian Kane from the advisory board?
I'm here, Eric. Hello.
Okay. I'm just looking at everyone here. I think that's everyone who's formally a part of the committee. I won't, because we got a number of people here, I won't go through, and we won't do sort of just general introductions if that's okay. So before we do public comment, I do want to just do a little like level setting and then give an overview of the agenda today. So, at the last meeting, I think we had a really great conversation talking both about what we think is just trying to define the problem of the cost increases, and also even talking about like potential solutions. When I think of, sort of how to run a good process where you're exploring kind of a challenging problem and trying to come up with a recommendation, I think of it as sort of the first stage is like an opening. And then the second stage is kind of a narrowing once you've identified potential recommendations. And then a third stage is a closing where now you're coming up with like a recommendation or, or a policy solution. So I still feel like we're in the opening stage right now. And I think we're going to have a couple more meetings over the course of the summer to start to kind of narrow and then eventually close. So at the first meeting, we heard a lot about interest in really trying to dig into like what's driving cost increases, when does it happen in our process, how do other MPOs, particularly in Massachusetts, deal with cost increases, and then there was a body of work that that we had presented to us, over the past couple of years around cost effectiveness and how could that potentially be incorporated into this. So what we thought today was we were going to focus on just sort of some information sharing. And this is sort of more of an information sharing kind of learning meeting where we're going to, where after public comment, Matt Genova has put a really great presentation together on when projects go up in cost. So he'll give an overview of that. He also connected with Ben Muller and has some information on benchmarking and what Cape Cod and SERPED do. And then he's going to give a little overview of the previous sort of conversations that the MPO had with respect to cost effectiveness and even some information we got from some national experts like Beth Osborne with Transportation for America and kind of what the state of Virginia does with incorporating cost effectiveness into the process. So that's kind of the heart of the meeting. And then we can have a discussion and kind of talk about, are there other, for the next meeting, are there other areas we want to kind of dig into and get more information about? And then we can finalize by talking about just doing some scheduling over the course of over the summer. Does that sound good? Any questions on the agenda for today? So let me turn it over to public comment. And I'll just say before I call on anyone, anybody can make a public comment now, but if during the process you also have a question or want to make a comment, we can call on you. I can call on you during that process as well after I hear from all the committee members. Is there anyone that would like to just kick it off with a public comment? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone. Again, use the raised hand function if you want that. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt now to talk about just the discussion of TIP project cost trends.
Thanks, Eric. Just give me one sec, just getting set up here.
And I'm just going to note, I think Jim Fitzgerald just joined us from the city of Boston.
Yep. Hey, Eric. Sorry,
Hey, Jim.
Jim Fitzgerald. I'm in Kent Park Plaza, but I'm on my phone, and I think other folks are logging in now.
Okay.
Laptops. So I'm with the VPDA.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Eric, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's having a great week. So as Eric noted, I've got 3 different presentations today, although the first 2 presentations are going to have a decent amount of overlap with each other. So I want to keep this pretty conversational, really utilize the full committee meeting setting rather than the full MPO meeting setting. So please feel free to jump in with questions or comments. And, I'll stop obviously at the end of each section here for discussion, and then we can continue on. So the goal of this first presentation is really to give us a common understanding of some of the trends that we've seen in MPO funded projects here in the Boston region over the last decade or so. So the data that we are working with today is a sample of 50 MPO funded projects going back to federal fiscal year 2016. So slightly less than half of these projects have made it all the way through the TIP process to advertisement for construction bids, while the others remain active in the current TIP, which you all would have seen throughout this spring. So at our last meeting, some questions came up around when we see cost changes and what those changes look like. So as you can see in the chart here on the slide, we see the greatest increases in cost between when projects are approved by MassDOT's Project Review Committee and when they reach the 25% design stage. So that's the bars on the left-hand side of the screen. On average, we see a 43% cost increase at this stage, with a median cost increase of 28%. You'll notice that all of the medians are lower than the averages. And this is because we have a handful of projects in the sample here that have total cost increases of 150% or greater over their lifespan. And that obviously drives up the average quite a bit for the overall sample. So clearly projects are not immune from cost increases after the 25% design stage, as we see smaller cost increases throughout the lifespan of the project. But obviously these are still very real cost increases that add up over time, at the 75% and 100% design stages. So for the 22 projects in our sample that have made it all the way through to 100% design and are either advertised or very close to advertisement, we're seeing an average cost increase of roughly 60% and a median cost increase of roughly 44%. I see Ken has his hand raised, so I can.
Yeah, just real quick, Brian. So when you say MPO funded, you're only talking about target projects or projects on the state cycle. Those are MPO funded too. So.
Yeah, sorry. This is regional target funded projects.
I'm sorry. What was that?
These are just the projects funded using regional target funds.
Okay, and these did you distinguish between projects that are designed by municipalities versus ones that are designed by MassDOT? Because some target projects are.
I did not in this sample, but that's certainly information that I could bring back for another meeting if folks are interested in that. Yeah, and I guess that's actually, I'm glad you raised that question now. So, as we're going here, I definitely want to make sure that we're answering any of these questions that come up along the way. So please let me know if there are, sort of other data points you'd like me to bring in, and, we can follow up at a future meeting with that. So we'll sort of take note of those along the way. Okay, I see Len has his hand up as well.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too. I'm very interested in what Ken asked for. Thank you. Okay,
perfect.
And yeah. I think Ken's point probably here is this is a smaller amount of like how many. It'd be nice to know how many projects we're talking about here, because obviously, that how many projects between 2016 and 2026.
Yeah, so this
also would be helpful to sort of, if there's something that is, municipalities are doing versus other, it would be good to sort of try to understand what to do about something when you know what the cause is or what it's applying to. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Definitely something we can follow up with. Yeah, and I'll just say, so the overall sample here is 50 projects funded by the MPO using target funds. Okay, we'll dive in here. And again, other questions, please jump in along the way. So if we assume here that a project is sort of right at the median for a cost increase at each design stage, this is what sort of the overall cost curve would look like, shown in blue here for the project over its lifespan from PRC approval to 100% design. So in an ideal case, we would see a project programmed in the TIP with a sort of 16% cost premium added onto its original cost estimate. And that follows the current practice of adding a 4% contingency to project costs for every year beyond the first year of the TIP. So this assumes that, if a project was programmed in the 5th and final year of the TIP, we'd have 4 years of 4% contingency added on. So when it's first programmed in the TIP, it would sit at a 16% premium. Then every year as the project moves towards advertisement, 4% would be pulled back out of that. So the ideal case is obviously a project, its cost remains exactly as it was when it was PRC approved, and that's where it ends up in final design. So you can obviously see the disparity between these two lines is really the problem that we are addressing through these conversations. Ken, you want to jump in again?
Yeah, sorry to bother you again, but just I think it would also be helpful if you got the average and median of the time between each of these steps, because if it's 10 years on average between PRC approval and 25% design and only 3 years between 25% and 75%, that could be explanatory in terms of inflation and things like that. So I think that would be another helpful piece of information to have.
Definitely. So you're sort of getting at a sneak preview of what's coming in just a couple slides. So we're on it, but you're definitely thinking along the right lines here. Yeah, thanks, Ken. So let's see here. So this, it's really, the question then becomes like, what impact does this sort of, median cost curve have across the whole sample of projects? And so as you can see here, by the time projects reach 25% design, more than half of all projects in our 50 project sample have already seen cost increases of 20% or more. By the time we get all the way to 100% design, 70% of all projects have gone up by at least 20%. So this is clearly not a case where just a handful or even 20 or 25% of projects are driving up the average and even the median a little bit for everyone else. I mean, this is really a problem that is pervasive across a vast majority of the projects that we have funded over the last 10 years. So breaking that down a little bit further, you can see here that we do have 5 projects in our 50 project sample that actually saw their cost decrease from their original estimate, which is very exciting. But the other, 90% of projects here clearly did not see that. So majority of projects here are seeing cost increases of 40% or greater. And you can see, unfortunately, our highest bar here, our greatest number of projects, is all the way to the right, with costs that have more than doubled over their lifespan in the TIP from initial estimate to 100% design. So getting to Ken's question here. So one of the questions that did come up at our last meeting, which I think I was also curious about, is sort of what is the relationship between how long it takes to advance a project and the overall scale of cost increase that it sees. So when we look at the number of months between each design milestone, the longest timelines are between PRC approval and 25% design. And again, this is also where we see the highest, the largest cost increases. From there, the number of months between milestones decreases with each step in the process. Again, here the averages are much higher than the medians. And this is largely because a handful of the projects that we've funded took 7 years or longer to advance from PRC approval, which is when they would have had their original cost estimate done, to 25% design. So when you have a project that is on the shelf for 7 years, or most of 7 years before advancing to 25%, obviously that leaves a lot of time for inflation to work its magic and leave us with a much higher cost estimate. So one sort of bit of positive news here is that this dynamic shouldn't really happen that much going forward, however. So last year, MassDOT began a practice of requiring that projects place a designer under contract within 2 years of being PRC approved. So if a proponent doesn't accomplish that, the project will be deactivated, and then it would have to be reapproved with a new cost estimate by MassDOT's project review committee in order to move forward in the TIP process. And so a part of that process was actually deactivating a bunch of projects that have been PRC approved in 2010 or earlier that really hadn't been active in a long time. So big thanks to MassDOT here for sort of clearing the roles on some projects that have been lingering for a while. So this dynamic should sort of be less of an impact over time, which is good. So overall, we're seeing a median design timeline for projects of 78 months or 6.5 years. This median is actually not really that bad, as this is what a timeline would look like for a project that uses its 2-year grace period that I just mentioned after PRC approval, and then gets programmed in the 5th and final year of the TIP and moves forward from there. The unfortunate part of this being the median timeline is that means that half of all projects take longer than 6.5 years to accomplish these same steps. So the big question here is obviously whether or not there's a clear relationship between how long a project takes to be designed and how much its cost increases. So on the slide here, you can see a plot of this relationship. And again, this is for the 23 projects in our sample that have made it all the way to 100% design. As you can tell by the very low R squared value here of 0.01. The relationship between the design timeline and the cost increase for a project is very weak. So I think, I myself was expecting this to be a sort of stronger relationship. But again, this is for the 23 projects that have made it all the way through to 100% design. Let's see, Eric's got his hand up here.
So just to be clear, you thought that if a project was more expensive or more costly, it would increase in cost over time?
So, sort of the hypothesis was that if a project takes longer to advance through the design process, then
Okay.
cost would increase more over that time. And we certainly see that, still like some of these projects that took 250 plus months to move through the design process did see cost increases of 50% or greater, but unfortunately for our whole sample, that's actually not a notable cost increase. And then I did, I guess following on to this, just did another analysis of what this looks like just at the 25% design stage, because this is when we see the biggest cost increases, and also in many cases, the longest design timelines. So it's the same analysis, comparing the same variables just over a shorter time period for design. And for these 48 projects that have made it all the way to 25% design, the relationship is a little bit stronger, but is really still not all that clear that the timeline for a project getting to 25%, necessarily predicts how much we'll see a cost increase. Although that obviously has happened for a handful of projects in the sample here. And then wrap here with just a couple of handful of key takeaways. So as I noted, the largest cost increases are really at the 25% design stage, but costs do continue to increase throughout project development, although at a lower rate at each step. The median tip project, again, has a 44% cost increase over its lifespan and a 6.5-year development timeline. But then 70% of projects have a cost increase that is 20% or greater. So again, this is sort of a pervasive problem across our target funded sample of projects. And again, the relationship between a project development timeline and cost increases is positive. There's some relationship there that we would expect, but it's not all that predictive, as it's a pretty weak relationship between those two variables. So that ends the sort of first section here, so we can open it up from there for a conversation.
Yeah, why don't we pause and just see if folks have questions about this? Len Diggins.
Thanks, Matt. This is great. I mean, I really appreciate the last two regression analyses that you did. And what's striking to me is that if you took out those outliers, the relationship would be even weaker. And so it's not what I expected. And I guess so the question for the cost increase, the basic comparison is at the PRC point, right? That's where you determine, that's where you set your initial cost, and then everything's compared to that, right?
Yeah, so basically what I did was compare the cost increase sort of at each step. And so the cost increase at 25% design would be the percentage from PRC, but then the cost increase at 75% design would be sort of compounding. So that would be the cost from then the 25% stage.
Okay.
I did it that way just because that's sort of how we navigate these at each year when we put together the tip. We sort of see that next step and then have to find something to do with that increase.
Right.
But, I could certainly do the analysis.
No. That makes perfect sense. I mean, and so I was asking just to make sure we understood where the comparison was. So still compelling evidence. So thank you very much.
Brian Kane.
Thanks, Eric. Matt, great work. Let me just echo that. And I guess maybe this is sort of a next steps question. Any sense of the projects that increased in cost, how much of it had to do with scope change versus just general inflation or sort of underlying issues? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's definitely a question that I want to dig into more. Unfortunately, just the time between the last couple meetings didn't have a chance to go into sort of a project by project analysis. But just thinking back to the sample of projects that we had, that we saw cost increases on for this year, just earlier this spring in the tip cycle, a number of projects, it was definitely a range. I mean, some projects did see scope added to them, and so that produced a clear cost increase. But there were several projects that were really just cited sort of inflating material costs and the like. And so I think we would see a mix, but I would definitely love to do a deeper analysis of sort of the relative degrees of those things.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I noted that as kind of a next step piece to look into. Ben Muller.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Matt, for that presentation. It's very helpful. I would be curious to see sort of a breakout of by MPO investment program, or sort of a rough categorization, since some of those aren't quite the same throughout the sample. I know when we've looked internally, we've noticed certain types of projects move quicker and have fewer cost increases. So I think it'd be interesting to see, of the projects that did get advertised, how those align with MPO priorities.
Yeah, also a great question. Definitely something I can bring back.
Thank you, Ben. Jim Fitzgerald.
Thanks, Eric and Matt. It's great information. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Could you just reiterate the new PRC requirement? It's within 2 years you need to have a designer under contract for full 25% design, or is it just kind of have one kind of getting started on the design?
So I'll let Ben correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the designer has to be under contract through 100% design.
Through 100%. Oh, okay. Just wondering if it's not worth thinking about whether or not that needs to happen sooner, and if it could be under contract for a lesser amount of design work for, so at least we're getting a professional consultant looking at costs earlier on. If we're, within a year, you have someone at least under contract for up to 25%, since that is obviously the kind of key milestone where costs seem to be skyrocketing between kind of concept and 25%. And if we didn't have that requirement to try to refine that quicker, I think it might help.
Thank you, Jim. Ken Miller.
Thank you. Matt, could you go back to the last, please? Just sort of curious about something. I would venture to say if you only looked at the first 15 months, you would get a pretty high a much higher correlation between increases and time. Right? If you cut it off at 15, looked at only between 0 and 50, you probably get a much higher correlation. And I don't know if that's helpful or not. But the other thing is, I would say, is that estimates are not the actual cost of the project also. So another piece of information might be helpful would be to look at what the actual awarded costs were, cost. Now, remember, the awarded cost is not the total federal participating cost, right? You have to take the awarded cost and adjust it to get to apples and oranges with total federal participating costs, because that's just the contract value. But it may be estimating issues also, because again, remember, and for folks that don't know, for the difference between the awarded amount and the programmed amount, that is made up. The MPO does not pay for that. So so whether a cost is higher or lower once it's awarded, that comes out of a separate STIP line item for award adjustments and EWOs and things like that. So that information might also be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. John Bouchard.
Yes, thank you, Eric, very much. Matt, nice job so far in this. I know you've done a lot of work on it. I just wanted to make the distinction that we found a delay at MassDOT once a project was approved at PRC to getting a designer on board. And if the distinction says under contract through full design, that's being changed. We wanted to make sure that once a project was approved, that a community had brought on a designer within 24 months. Wasn't that they had achieved 25% design, but it was that they had to have hired a design consultant within 24 months of PRC approval. And then we send out reminders to the communities if we haven't learned, in year one, with 1 year remaining, and then with 6 months remaining, and then we get to that 24-month window, that questioning, have you brought on a designer yet? Are you in the process? Do you need any assistance and stuff like that? Because, having been a consultant for a number of years, I raised the issue with my colleagues at MassDOT about getting municipalities to get under contract through full design at various stages of a project, because it tied up a big chunk of their either Chapter 90 or their finances. Because as we could see in some of the charts, it takes a long time to go through projects. There's some that have been around for, 50, 60, 100 months, 200 months. And communities had a real challenge that money had been committed and was not available to do other, especially if they used their Chapter 90 money to do other things that were needed. And we tried to look at phasing, or we've looked at phasing of the contracts such that it would not burden a community with that challenge. So it is something we're looking at more closely, but that 24 months was really because we were finding communities would get a project approved, and then it would take a real lot of time to get a contractor or a consultant on board, and that time frame ate up a lot of float. And then it was also trying to get it onto the regional tip was a challenge as well. And then, trying to move it forward as quickly as they could. So it is something MassDOT, at MassDOT that we're looking at closely and trying to make it, a little bit better for the cities and towns on how they can hire consultants, get them under contract, and then where the milestones are, so we don't overly burden them with those financial decisions.
John, 2 questions. When was that policy implemented?
The 24-month policy was actually introduced just before I joined the Highway Division, so it's going to be 4 years ago when it was first put together.
Okay. So so a lot of the projects that we've encountered haven't really implemented that policy yet then.
That's correct. It's really only been since I joined in January of 18, so it was prior to that. I think it was the summer of 17 that was initially implemented.
So this could potentially address a chunk of the problem, something to consider. And then my other question for you, John, is, so why do you think municipalities, once they've gone through the effort of getting something PRC approved, that they just don't then act on advancing the project?
Eric, I don't know if I'd say they don't act on advancing, but there's a process. And what we've heard from cities and towns what we have heard is that they need assistance in scoping the project, sufficiently. And then putting together an RFP and bringing on a designer and going through the selection process it's not something that they have a lot of experience in. Some communities anyway. So those were some of the challenges, making sure they had the right scope for the project. And this goes back to, I think it was Brian Kane's comment about, the cost increases. How many of those cost increases were attributed to scope changes? Or was it just material changes because of the time that it took a project from initial inception, PRC approval to when we got to final? And, so scoping the project properly, we're trying now, and I think I shared this with the MPO last year when we started putting together our pre-25% design checklist and scoping session. And we're now scoping projects with the community, with their designer, and with members of our internal team prior to 25% design to make sure that all of the scope factors within our design guidebook are being followed. Our newer policies on healthy transportation, et cetera, are being factored into the design. So we don't get a project design submission at 25% that doesn't address all of the items that are within our purview for reviewing the project and moving it forward. So, excuse me.
Thank you, John.
Sure.
Any other questions about this first presentation today? Okay. Why don't you move on, Matt, then to talking about what some other MPOs do.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, and all good questions, and definitely, again, stuff that we can bring back to future meetings. Before we move on, I also actually just want to give, I meant to do this at the outset, but just want to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Matt Archer, for pulling together a lot of the data on project costs over time that was used in the previous presentations analyses. Certainly a heavy lift. So big thank you for that. Okay, so second presentation here is actually going to be thematically similar to a lot of what we just talked about, but will sort of enter into a little bit of new territory as well. So this is really around project benchmarking and hitting different milestones. So starting with a review of the Boston MPO's current process, which is admittedly not all that robust. So right now, MPO staff will help many project proponents get through PRC approval. So this often includes a discussion with municipalities around their project scope and goals. Certainly not in the detail that a pre-25% meeting would entail, like John Bouchard just noted. But this is really more of a determination of whether or not a project is a good fit for pursuing TIP funding. Does it align with the MPO's goals? Does it fit into one of the MPO's investment programs? Those sorts of questions. So we walk through all that with municipalities. And this also involves a lot of coordination up front with MassDOT highway district staff, who take the lead on making sure that proponents have what they need to fill out MassDOT's project initiation forms. So these forms ask a lot of detailed questions on the current conditions in the project area and on what the proponent intends to accomplish with their project. So there's actually a decent amount of overlap between what's requested from proponents in MassDOT's project initiation process and also what we need at the MPO level to score a project. So once a project is approved by the project review committee, the proponent again receives a letter that we've sort of touched on a little bit here, detailing some of the requirements that must be met to advance the project. So that includes what we just talked about with having a design consultant under contract, but also includes some other commentary, including a note saying that it is expected that the project proponent will attempt to constrain project costs to available funding. There's also information here on requirements for things like right-of-way acquisition, environmental permitting, and other aspects of project development. From there, setting a project development timeline is really handled by MassDOT project managers, the project proponent, and their consultant. So this is something that MPO staff don't really play an active role in. We more so just receive the information as it's developed sort of on the MassDOT side of things with proponents. So, I'll note here, and we sort of got to this theme a little bit, but, some projects receive PRC approval and just continue design straight away with or without TIP funding allocated to them. So as we talked about last week a little bit, this involves a little bit more upfront risk by municipalities, investing their money in a project that they haven't yet secured capital funding for. But this also puts their project in a position to jump into an earlier year of the TIP if funding becomes available, and certainly enables them to better stay on a design timeline that doesn't involve any delays through the TIP process, year to year when we're looking at projects that need to get delayed because they're not advanced enough in design. On the flip side of that, some projects are programmed in the TIP and then don't make a ton of design progress in their first 1 to 2 years. So the main project status check-in each year with projects sort of at all levels is TIP Readiness Day in February. So this is an annual meeting between MassDOT staff and MPO staff where each project that's currently programmed in the TIP is discussed, and those projects that are at risk of being delayed are flagged. So the outcomes of this meeting are really what you all see as the MPO board, as those project flags in the larger list of projects when we start talking about TIP programming every spring. And I'll just say as a quick aside, this at this point is really when we see the highest level of engagement from project proponents. During the overall year, communication is sort of less robust with proponents along the way, but obviously when a project is flagged for being over cost, delayed, etc., that's when we see proponents sort of jump into the conversation, especially at the MPO level. Obviously, lots of public comments, those sorts of things. So I'd say that TIP Readiness Days really drives that sort of peak engagement in February and March every year, which you all see. So let's see. So obviously we have our current approach, but there are at least 2 other methods for handling project benchmarking that are used by MPOs here in Massachusetts. So the first is more of a requirements-based approach where specific timelines are set for projects to achieve each major milestone. The second is what I'll call sort of a guidance-based approach, which is where proponents are offered more robust support by MPO staff in navigating the project development process. So the Cape Cod Commission uses the first approach, which sets clear benchmarks that projects must hit in order to continue to advance in each TIP cycle. So as you can see on the slide here, and this is just a screenshot of one of their slides, so thank you to the Cape Cod Commission for putting this together. So projects may be programmed in the 5th year of the TIP, so the last year, before they reach 25% design. But from there, in order to advance in each successive TIP cycle, the project would have to hit 25% design, then 75% design, and 100% design over the following 3 years. That puts the project obviously in excellent shape to be advertised for construction bids in year 1, which is the goal that we are all striving for here. A different approach, the second approach that we'll talk about today, is used by Southeastern Mass MPO. And that really focuses on providing proponents with an abundance of information upfront to facilitate a smoother project development process. So SERPED offers proponents a 50-page primer to guide them forward through the TIP process. This guide includes highly detailed information on a number of projects, or a number of topics rather, including how to initiate their project with MassDOT, the importance of early public engagement in project design, an outline of the requirements for submitting a successful 25% design. The guide includes a number of links to relevant MassDOT resources on project design, right-of-way permitting, etc. And the guide even includes a sample MassDOT municipal project agreement, which would be agreed to as part of the advertisement process at the end of project development. So again, the focus here from SERPED is really on making sure that proponents have all the information they need upfront to be successful, rather than specifically requiring that certain design milestones be hit at certain times. And I'll say, as another sort of quick aside here, we at the Boston MPO used to, once upon a time, have something along the lines of this guidance document that sort of fell by the wayside roughly a decade ago, but it's something that staff are looking to sort of revitalize and bring back. So we can talk more about that as well if folks have thoughts on that subject. Jay, I don't know if you want to go ahead and jump in now.
Yeah, I'm just curious to hear what MassDOT's perspective is on these different guidance methods, particularly the one used in the Cape Cod Commission, where there's a strict timeline. And obviously the municipality probably carries the burden of the timeline primarily, but there are other agencies and other bodies, including MassDOT and other regulatory agencies that would factor into that as well. I'm just curious to hear MassDOT's perspective as to how they feel that process works or how they engage with it.
And do you think you could comment on that, or John Bouchard?
Yeah, I can speak to the sort of planning's perspective on that. And I'll leave it to John if he has a different perspective from the higher division. But I know over the past few years, we've been looking at similar issues internally and looking and sort of statewide, and other MPOs are also facing similar issues. And so we have sort of laid out internally some different approaches that we might be interested in pursuing in the long term. None of them are sort of encased in stone or sort of approved yet now, but we've been tossing around very similar ideas.
Matt, can you go back to the Cape Cod slide for a second?
Yeah.
So, so the pro here is that basically projects are much more advanced in the process before they get programmed on the tip, and so that addresses a lot of the cost increase issues, sort of between PRC and 25% design. The con from the municipal perspective, which I think the point Jay was trying to make is that more of the responsibility now is on or not more of the responsibility, but there's more risk, right, for the municipality to be putting resources into advancing a project without guarantee that it is actually going to be on the tip. Is that right?
Well, no, I think my question, Eric, was that, the city could do everything in its power to keep the project on schedule, but the city is not the only factor in keeping a project on schedule. It could be any number of agencies, MassDOT, and it's not throwing anybody under the bus, just saying that there are other factors to keeping a project on schedule. And so how does that work, right? If those factors arise, how does MassDOT view that? How does the MPO view that? Does a project get booted out because of something that wasn't necessarily in the town's control?
And then Matt, how does this compare to we don't have any, the Boston MPO, we don't have any hard policies on at what level of design you have to be at to be programmed in the tip, right? Except that we won't program things on the tip in like year 2 unless it's at like 75% design. I forget what exactly our policy is.
Yeah, so right now we really just lean pretty heavily on MassDOT's review process as a part of tip readiness days each year. And so, so in some ways, like the system here, from Cod Commission really doesn't necessarily boot projects off the tip, but it just prevents them from moving into earlier years if they haven't hit these milestones. And effectively, that's what we sort of do anyways. We just wait longer before we start, really enforcing that. So typically only projects in, what would be the first or second year of the following tip, so the new tip that's being developed, have a sort of timeline requirement on them to say like, okay, if you're, still at PRC approval and you're about to be in year 2 of the tip, like you're probably going to be delayed and not be allowed to move into year 2. But we sort of do a lot of this, sort of jockeying for position among, project delays and then moving other projects into gaps in the early part of the tip in the first 2 years. And so it's sort of the same process, just with less of a proactive approach.
Yeah.
And I saw Steve raise his hand.
Yes, Steve, thank you for raising your hand from the Cape Cod Commission.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to discuss here. Certainly happy to follow this discussion because these are shared challenges that all of our regions face. So I thought it might be helpful to give a little perspective on the development very briefly, and then Colleen Medeiros, Commission staff who manages the TIP, may have something to add in as well. But just in terms of development, these guidelines were put together by Commission staff, but really reflect the feelings of our Joint Transportation Committee, which is really mostly DPW directors from the town. So it was really them coming to the table, wanting some sort of guidance to kind of keep them accountable. There are certainly concerns about starting to bring forward design without getting it on the tip. But I think there are concerns on the other side as well, that projects were getting on the tip and just not moving along quickly enough. So this was just kind of giving them some clear guidance. And then it's really up to that group to make recommendations to the MPO if there's a project that's not keeping up. So it's not so bright line that if it's not making it, that gets cut immediately. It really is just a point of discussion. And then that director has to kind of justify why they're not where they should be, what actions are being taken to keep it on track. So it's really just to kind of, I know it's tough for anyone to push a project off or kick a project back. So just kind of leveling the playing field for discussion amongst the DPW directors. And Colleen really developed this. I don't know if she has anything to add in terms of the way it's being utilized.
Colleen, do you have anything to add? Let us know. Feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, no, Steve really covered most of it. And fortunately, we've been having a problem of having too many projects that are eligible in that outer year. So this kind of helps, especially this year. We had a project that was just PRC approved, looking to get on the tip. However, we had a project that was already near 100% design. So kind of having this helped make that decision a little bit less political and a little easier to understand why a project that has been further designed should be on.
That's interesting. Okay, thank you very much. Brian Kane.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I just, more of just a general question. Why is it a 5-year process or more? Is that how long it usually takes, or is that just an arbitrary thing that we've set? Or, I mean, if the original, the first part of Matt's presentation holds that it's cheaper to do stuff quicker, shouldn't part of what we're trying to work at here be speeding up this process? But if it has to be 5 years, then someone tell me that. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe, yeah, Ben, why don't you go ahead? Maybe one of the municipalities too could speak, or even someone else from MassDOT. But Ben, please.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just the only thing I'll say is that this is an acceleration of the process. I mean, so I think we're aiming for that, to accelerate the process, but where we are is behind sort of the schedule that the Cape Cod Commission has adopted.
Well, that might be a good question for further, research a little bit about just kind of the time, why. Yeah, I agree with you. 6.5 years feels like a long time, but it might be it is what it is. Ken Miller.
Yes, thank you. Just to be clear, PRC approval, and correct me if this has changed, Ben or John. PRC approval does not say that it's necessarily a great project. There's really not a great deal of evaluation.
Right.
It says that it's an eligible project, and that a proponent has the right to gets a number, and that MassDOT staff has something to charge to when they review things, and that they can move forward. But it's not a guarantee, and they used to say in the letters approving, it is not a guarantee of funding. It is not. It is so. If you accelerated every project, and I'm not saying projects should not be accelerated, but if you accelerated every project, and you would have, you can't fund the projects that you have now. How are you going to fund if all the projects get ready a lot quicker? You can't fit everything in. So let's be clear. PRC is not a carte blanche to say, hey, you got a great project and guarantee the MPO is going to fund it, right? The MPO still does an evaluation, and it's always a municipality, if it's a municipality's risk to do the design, not knowing if it's going to get how it's going to be evaluated by the MPO. So I think you need to be careful about saying, hey, every project needs to get going right out of the gate. Frankly, I have a little bit of a concern by MassDOT. I wasn't aware that MassDOT was telling folks that, hey, it gets approved by PRC, you have to get somebody on the contract by 2 years, within 2 years, because if I'm a municipality, guess what? I want to get some sense from the MPO whether it's going to get programmed before I make that investment, right? So I don't know. I think
That's a good, Ken, that's a good point about when we're sort of measuring when the clock starts, PRC approval versus programmed on the tip or something like that. That's a really good point. John Bouchard, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I have another meeting in a few minutes, but I wanted to comment on Jay Monty's question and then on what Ken offered. When a project is approved at PRC and then moves forward, we'll process the project as efficiently as we can. We've tried to improve on our project delivery side with a lot of different things. One, we're trying to scope the project more completely and accurately earlier on in the process. We do not want to list a project in the tip until we feel it's a viable project. When we may get a submit, we don't review submittals because this one came in before that one. Sometimes it's where the project is on the delivery schedule, where it is in the region's tip. If something's on, year 1 and it came in 2 weeks later than something that's on year 4, that might get elevated to the front of the line because that has a tighter window to be approved or to be reviewed and approved. So Brian Kane's comment about the 5-year, that's here and this is accelerated. We're processing projects as efficiently as we can based on completeness and readiness. And when we ask or we recommend a project get moved off to a future year, it's based on our ability or the project's ability to reach those milestones. It could be right of way, it could be permitting. There could be design challenges or community support that haven't been fully secured and stuff like that. It's not because we don't think it's a good project. It's not because we don't like the project. It's more about, making sure the funds don't lapse and there's an ability to deliver, within that timeline. And so we have, tried to reduce our review timelines such that projects within the first 2 years of the tip that come in get 30-day reviews. When we get into years 3, 4, and 5, they may go to 60 and 90-day reviews once they come in. And if there's a need to accelerate, then we honor that as best we can with the staff that we have, and try to move forward. We'll do things as efficiently as we can. I think it is difficult to put together such a rigid, project readiness guideline. We do have some items that we've put together that we try to follow internally, and it's sometimes just the ability to deliver the project, to complete the work that's necessary, and where it fits within the overall funding program. So I'll do my best to participate in future meetings. I had an opening because the MPO was canceled, and I wanted to call in and see where you guys were headed with things and see if I could be of some value. But I have another meeting, so I'm going to step off now, and I'll follow up with others and see if there are things I can offer in the future.
John, thank you. We really appreciate that. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Len Diggins.
Yeah, thanks, John. You're always a value. And with respect to the amount of time, yes, let's go ahead and see if things can be done more quickly. But I think John kind of touched on this. Part of what takes time in the design phase is the community input, and that's something that we all value a lot. And so it's hard to move that faster, really. And these things are these projects are complex. Even the small ones are complex, and I'm sure. We're talking averages here, but big project, it's going to be very complex to design. So I'm not really that surprised. That it takes as long as it does. I think what we really need to do is take that into account when we think about how much a project is going to cost. And once again, I think the 4% non-compounded is just kind of asking for error or a low estimation of the impact of inflation. So we might want to change that. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Ben Miller.
Thanks. I just wanted to not lose sight of one of the other benefits of both the Cape and Southeast Mass's approach here is that there's sort of a closer engagement between the MPO staff and the project proponents on a more recurring basis in order to sort of develop these TIP readiness recommendations on the Cape. They have the public works directors from the municipalities there in the room, and they're talking about their projects. They're talking about them with the district in a public meeting on a monthly basis and making recommendations to the MPO. And similarly, Southeast Mass, they're building that relationship very early between MPO staff who are intimately familiar with the project development timeline and with district staff and with MassDOT requirements and federal requirements, and municipal staff who often aren't, or maybe only do one project every decade. They don't necessarily have the capacity internally for that. Whereas, the process Matt laid out at the beginning, there's fewer touchstones between the Boston MPO, CTPS, and the municipal project proponents. And a lot of those touchstones are filtered through MassDOT. And I think there's opportunities there to sort of increase that relationship, to identify project risks and make sure that we're identifying the right projects for programming.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I hear that, and that's obviously, yeah, what SERPED is doing. I also wonder, it is obviously easier for other MPOs in Massachusetts where they're mostly dealing with like one district office, and they have much fewer municipalities and probably projects too. So I know there's sort of a challenge, like a difference there between the scope and size of like what we're doing, but it does seem that like having more touchstones, like there's more opportunity to kind of catch projects. So Matt, do you want to keep going?
Yeah, for sure. We could jump into the final section here. Just one brief comment on the project timelines. So, I mean, not all projects take all that long. I mean, we do have a handful of projects that have moved through the Boston MPO's, target funding process over the last, in the sample size, so over the last 10 years, that move through in 3 years or less. And so those tend to be, a little bit smaller projects, but it is possible for, a project that's only a few $1 million, maybe an intersection or two, or a small corridor, that isn't all that complex. It is possible for those projects, if their design is moving forward, to just go ahead and move through the tip pretty quickly. And so that's something we can sort of consider too when programming projects. So just want to throw that out there. Okay. Oh, actually, sorry, realized we didn't get to this last slide here. So I did just a quick snapshot of the current tip, or the new tip, the 22 through 26 tip, and just wanted to know sort of how they would stack up if we did this, sort of analysis by year and current design status. So 2/3 of the tip projects in the current tip were first programmed when we're at the PRC approval stage. So they hadn't hit 25% design yet at that point when they were first programmed. And as you see here in blue, in years 3 and 4, we have 5 projects that are still sort of on the starting blocks here, still at PRC approval, which is how they were programmed over the last couple of tip cycles. A majority of projects in the new tip are at 25% design, as shown here in orange on the slide, and that includes 2/3 of projects in years 1 and 2, 2022 and 2023. So obviously we do have several projects at 75% design here in gray, as well as a couple of projects at 100% design, which is very exciting, although those are in year 1 of the tip, which ideally is where most or all projects would be at that stage. So, the sort of upshot of all this is if we were to apply the benchmarking rules from, Cape Cod Commission to our target funded projects in the 22 through 26 tip, 23 out of 33 projects, or 70% of projects, would not meet the benchmarking requirements. And so they would be considered behind schedule.
Yeah, this is pretty in stark contrast, right, to what Cape Cod does. I mean, we've got a lot of projects in year 2, not to mention year 1, that are at 25% design.
Right. And so this goes back to something that we touched on earlier, which is, how basically our enforcement process for project timelines just happens late. And so typically, these projects end up in, year 2 of the tip, and they're at 25% design. And then the following tip, they get reprogrammed also in year 2 of the tip because they're still at 25% design. So a lot of projects just stick in that, first year or 2 and just sort of, stay in that space until they advance. But that means every year we're moving projects around to accommodate that, which is, much harder to do in years 1 and 2 of the tip than it is to do in year 4 or 5.
Wow. Okay. This is a really important data point right here.
Okay, yeah. So just a couple key takeaways on sort of this whole conversation before we get into the last section. So again, obviously we don't have really hard formal milestone requirements here at the Boston Region MPO. Second, there are a range of approaches to project benchmarking, obviously from requirements-based systems to guidance-based systems. And then finally, in line with our first conversation of the day, tighter timelines might help in a small way to limit cost increases. But again, the relationship here isn't super strong, and so keeping projects on schedule doesn't really solve the cost increase problem in its entirety by any means. But the upside of this is that this is all part of the same project development picture, and so having better sort of guidance on project development timelines would certainly foster a more reliable TIP process with fewer early year funding gaps like we've had in the last few TIP cycles. Okay, so that's the end of this section. I did see a hand come up, so I don't know if
Yeah, J.R. Fryhingham.
Yeah, on that slide where you were showing the number of projects, those 25%, is that you have an approved 25% design, or that you're in the 25% design process?
So this means that 25% design has been submitted, but for some projects, this would be an approved 25% and they're moving to a design public hearing. But for other projects, they may still be working through comments on their 25% design submission. Okay. So it is actually a good question, because one other note I just want to bring up is that some projects take several submissions before they get an approved 25% design. I think in the sample of our 50 projects, it's anywhere from the first submission, which is a majority of projects, but I think I saw as many as 5 25% design submissions before one was approved. So, some projects take a number of sort of passes at this before they can move forward.
So that would reflect that that's really encompassing the fact that you're still engaged in the 25% design process. You've got the potential for either significant increases in scope or complexity, which were not understood at the PRC level. And that's where you're really getting hit with your biggest cost increase. So that seems to kind of tie a nice little bow into understanding, where that challenge is.
Yeah, definitely think projects that especially have multiple submissions or that take longer in that 25% process can have, some extra layers of complexity that maybe a smaller project that moves forward quickly may not have. And obviously there can be significant implications for costs there, though not always. But that's a really good point. Thank you. Anyone else on this topic, I guess, before we jump into the next one?
Yeah, just Matt, this is Kane, just a quick question. So looking at this, one would say, well, how come why aren't the projects that are at 75% or close to 75%, why weren't they moved up into year 2 or even year 1 as opposed to and then why wouldn't the 25% projects have been moving out? What, right? I mean, that would be a logical approach. And I guess my other question would relate to evaluation. When this MPO, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't recall where this MPO ever evaluated a project that got a really low score, and then the MPO in effect sent the signal to the proponent, you know what? Don't spend your money. It's not going to get programmed. So everybody seems to get the green light. It's not clear to me that this MPO has ever not programmed something because of its score. I mean, I don't recollect. I'm sure it's happened, but I mean, does that happen? Does somebody say, gee, I got such a terrible score, low score, I give up. I'm not gonna.
Yes, I do actually. I think that does happen now. I think in the past 5 or 6 years, as our scoring has gotten more has gotten better and more specific about why projects aren't scoring. I think there are municipalities who are saying, you know what, I'm not going to score well. I think that's actually almost a controversial question, because I think some of the suburban communities feel like their projects aren't scoring as high. And so I think that is an issue, but I think there are people who are recognizing that they're not going to score well. And so they're trying to figure out how to do their project a different way.
Yeah, one recent example, yeah, smaller project that didn't score super well. It's like, you know, we can probably find some other funding source that might be a better fit. But yeah, Ken, to your point, that doesn't happen as often as it could, or we don't at least have that conversation as often as we could. Then I'm trying to think. You had an earlier point that I wanted to address. Oh, just on why are some projects at 75% not moved up while others at 25% are moved back? You know, I mean, we sort of take our guidance recommendations again from tip readiness days with MassDOT, and so you know, I think both MassDOT's goal and our goal in those conversations is to, you know, try not to move too many projects out if we don't absolutely have to. And by move out, I mean move into a later year. You know, so I think if there are projects that are even at 25%, but maybe they have already had their design public hearing and they're close to a 75% submission, you know, maybe staying in year 2 is okay. You know, and then the projects that are further out that are at 75% design, you know, it's probably mostly due to just, you know, financial limitations in earlier years. But I know I saw Ben's hand go up too, so you may also have a comment on that.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Yeah, I just wanted to say, you know, John Bouchard said this a little earlier, you know, readiness days is really sort of an advertisement risk-based approach. And the concern there is, you know, we're looking primarily at the first few years in the TIP and trying to identify which projects we don't think are going to make it for advertising, that we need to address sort of in an immediate perspective. And sort of because of the scope and scale of going through every project program statewide, you know, some of those projects in the outer years don't get as close a look, or, you know, the question is not, would this project be better served by moving up or what have you? It's, do we think that project is deliverable in the year it's currently programmed? And so that being the question, doesn't really lend itself to a more nuanced discussion of, is this the appropriate year for this project in this regional TIP in context of the other projects that are regionally prioritized. And I think just to the second point about the scoring, I do know for the last couple of years, MPO staff have put forward the highest scoring projects as recommendations for programming, and that recommendation has been generally well received. So not necessarily MPO staff saying these projects shouldn't be programmed, but there has been sort of acknowledgement that we should be programming the higher scoring projects as they come up.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, Matt, I think we can keep going.
Awesome. All right, moving into our last section here, which is just a recap of some of the conversations that we've had over the last number of years on TIP project cost effectiveness. So it's been about 1.5 years since our last real conversation on this subject. So I figured it'd be a good time to do a crash course refresher on all the ground we've covered, and especially for newer members and members of the public. This would be a good sort of summary of where we are. So the short history of this begins in 2016, where I believe some MPO board members attended a Transportation Leadership Academy where there was a big focus on performance management and project selection. So that sort of piqued an interest in, you know, a lot of the questions we're asking right now. How can we do this better? How can we keep costs under control? All those sorts of things. So MPO staff followed that conference with a memo also in 2016, outlining how municipalities currently contribute to funding projects, as well as the prospects for changing that system if need be. In 2017, Transportation for America supported the MPO with some technical assistance on benefit cost analysis, which was followed by additional technical assistance in 2019 on the TIP project selection criteria. But a part of that 2019 technical assistance was also some commentary on cost effectiveness scoring and how that relates to the overall scoring picture. And then finally, in 2019, 2019 technical assistance wound down then in early 2020 with a presentation to the MPO by Beth Osborne of Transportation for America, who talked about different approaches to cost effectiveness scoring done by transportation agencies around the country. So I'll give you a quick summary of each of these steps so you know sort of the basic gist of what those put forth as ideas. But I'll just note quickly that a handful of related materials here are posted to the MPO website for today. So that includes the 2017 white paper, the 2019 memo, and the 2020 presentation that Beth gave. So if you want to look at those, feel free to take a peek. You can get all the details. And I didn't have a chance to post the 2016 MPO staff memo, but that's certainly something we can share as a follow-on to this meeting. So on that memo, it contains a very brief overview of the current TIP programming process, including the project cost paid by proponents, the process for estimating these costs, and the factors that impact costs. The memo actually poses a lot of the same questions that we are asking now through this committee, including whether there should be a higher design threshold for initial project programming, what should happen when designs and costs change, and whether proponents should be expected to fund some portion of construction, including any cost increases. And again, we can share this memo afterwards, but I'll say that the memo is more focused on sort of just asking these questions and doesn't really put forth recommendations yet, but it was more so to get the conversation started at that time. So the oh, thank you, Kate. Appreciate you hunting that one down. So in the chat there, Kate shared the 2016 memo if folks want to take a peek at it. So in the 2017 white paper from T for America, 3 methods were discussed for introducing cost effectiveness scoring into the MPO's project evaluation process. So their first approach would be sort of a point in time analysis, which would really just enable the MPO to get a sense of the cost effectiveness of any given TIP or the selection of projects in a TIP. So just sort of, a check-in on how are we doing now with, at any point in time. There's also the pre-programming analysis method, which would support initial decisions on which projects should be funded. And then there are recurring analyses of cost effectiveness over time, which would allow projects to be rescored and reconsidered for funding if their cost or scope changes, beyond some sort of threshold. So each of these cost effectiveness approaches would involve a numerical score comparing the project's TIP evaluation score to its cost. The 2019 memo that T for America put together put a little bit finer point on some of these initial options, specifically recommending that the MPO institute a system of cost effectiveness scoring that divides project score by cost, resulting in a score per million or points per $1 million value that can be used to compare projects to each other. They advocated for projects to be ranked based on this score by project type, and for this ranking to be used as a key decision-making tool when selecting projects for funding. So in the final few slides here, I'll just highlight the 3 cost effectiveness case studies that Beth Osborne presented in her presentation from January of 2020 to the MPO. So starting with the Virginia DOT, which I think is an example that many of us have cited in discussions a number of times. So they divide their project score by cost and then rank all of their projects from here. So this is along the lines of what we just discussed on the last slide as a recommendation from T for America. And this is really their driving decision-making tool in selecting projects for funding. The results of this approach are that a larger number of lower cost projects are typically funded in any given funding round. And for larger projects, this system promotes a level of value engineering to keep costs down and give them a higher cost effectiveness score. So key to all this is that Virginia rescores projects if costs go up or if scopes change. And so this leads to a system where projects may be removed from the capital plan if the proponent can't find a way to bring their costs back down and improve their cost effectiveness score back in line with the rest of the program. I see Jay has his hand up, so I can stop there for a second.
If I recall, another key component of this was that the MPO funded the early stage of design. That was how they were able to, rescore and potentially, not program a project, was by taking some of that risk off of the proponent.
Yeah, their approach to design funding is a little bit different. And yeah, I think it did involve some MPO or state funding support for design. So thank you for bringing that up. Just a couple more examples, and then we can open up to a bigger conversation here. So the Atlanta Region Transit Link Authority uses a similar scoring process, but they then sort the projects by score into 4 different tiers. So tier 1 are the projects that everybody is looking for, low cost, high benefit projects. And these projects are the first off the list into the capital plan. So those are, move most quickly through the process into the funding pool and go from there. Tiers 2 and 3 are low cost, low benefit, and high cost, high benefit. So these 2 tiers are sort of jointly the next priority for funding after those tier 1 projects. And then finally, tier 4 projects are high cost, low benefit projects. And these are really not prioritized for funding at all. And so, to the point Ken made earlier about, giving all projects the green light, or most projects, using a tiered system like this, if a project ends up in tier 4, that might be a clear way to say sort of, this project doesn't really have the benefits we're looking for, and the cost doesn't really, isn't really worth our funding. So it gives a little bit more of a, some clarity on what that looks like. And I see Brian has his hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I guess this is for scoring. Have you ever seen a tiered funding approach where if somebody got for instance, a 4.4, they might not get funded at 100%, but get funded at 25%? Thank you.
It's a great question and a great idea. I don't have a good example for you off the top of my head, but I'm sure someone out there uses it. So, if other folks have ever seen something like that, like definitely feel free to bring that idea to the table, but I'm not aware of one yet. But certainly something we can look more into. Okay, one more example here, and then we are all set on slides. So last example here is from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the Bay Area. And so their approach, like the last approach, divides project benefit score by cost and then ranks for inclusion. And this was done for the Plan Bay Area 2040 plan. And so not like a rolling, ongoing capital planning process, but really more of a discrete, one-time, long-term planning process. So their focus is on programming projects, obviously with high cost effectiveness scores, like all of these approaches. And specifically, they're looking for projects with a score greater than 1, and they look at how each project helps the MTC meet its performance targets. And so this is similar to looking at project scores, but it's not quite the same as the performance targets, even though they are considered as part of scoring, are really sort of a discrete set of measures that are above and beyond just any specific criteria. And so this would be sort of an added layer of analysis here, on specifically, with respect to performance targets that the region prioritized. And so the results of this approach are that, all projects are then ranked, and then, the projects that score the highest and meet performance targets the best are then prioritized. But there's sort of a secondary process here where project sponsors can make a compelling case for inclusion if they have a cost effectiveness score below 1. And so basically, if your project didn't make the cut, you can say, hey, we still think this is a good project. We will rescope it and bring it back to bring the cost down or help it meet performance targets better. And so there's sort of a dialogue here as a part of the process that is of note as a part of this whole picture. So that's the last example, so I can stop there and we can open it up.
Any questions? Okay. Actually, I did have one question, and not about the cost effectiveness, but I'm looking to see do we have anyone from Cape Cod Commission? I think they left. No, Steve is still here. Steve, if you all program a project on the tip in like year 5, and it's PRC approved, but then it gets, I forget what it was, it gets to year 3 and you have to be at 25%. Do you kick projects off the tip? Have you ever done that before?
So the short answer is no, we have not kicked a project off, but it's only been in place for a little over a year. So we haven't had much experience. But what I will say is there was a specific project that was behind schedule, and then the town acted to really make sure that things were moving as quickly as they could on their end. And that kept it on the tip, although it was out a little further than they had hoped. So they demonstrated that they're making efforts to get it back on track. So it wasn't kicked off the tip, but it did slide back a little bit in terms of time.
Okay, thank you. So I think we can go to talking about kind of discussion and next steps on this. I mean, I will say from my perspective, I'm kind of interested in thinking about what are some things that we could do as an MPO to get at, getting projects, onto the tip as advanced as possible, so we can try to address the cost increases and see if there's an opportunity for more of those touchstones, so we can kind of track projects. I'm also then interested in thinking of like, is there a policy around incorporating cost effectiveness or some type of, rescoring when a project like does go in place. So sort of thinking about how do we improve our process so that projects we have a better sense of their costs when we're programming them. And then when they do go up in cost, we have a process for making a decision that's sort of transparent and like rational about what we do with that. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now, but I'd love to hear from others. So Jay Monty, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I really think we got to look at the cost kind of method, or not structure, but the way in which we assign costs and the timeline in which we assign costs. And I keep hearing in a number of settings here. I know I've been kind of advocating for this idea that maybe the MPO ought to be funding early design but programming the project later. I know we heard from John Bouchard saying that there's a struggle with communities that once they get PRC approved to suddenly cobble together the money to get to 25%. Brian Kane brought up a good point too, which is maybe there's an equity consideration and funding percentages of projects based on that. So I think I would love to have a deeper discussion about that, because I don't think that just kind of reevaluating, rescoring, cost benefit is really going to get at the root of this issue, because at the end of the day, you're going to be asking a community to vote against their fellow community when they have a lot of skin in the game already. And I don't think folks are going to do that. I think we're going to be right back at square one.
And just to understand, so your feeling is that if the MPO funded the design or a part of the design and not the municipality, that therefore, if you got to a point where you said, okay, this project is off the tip then the community wouldn't be harmed. Is that why you feel like? Right.
I feel like a 25% community may have expended several $100,000. They may have had a lot of political skin in the game with the community to get that funding. And I think if you were to fund that early phase of design, it would take some of that pressure off and allow a decision to be made without harming, like I said, harming the community as severely.
Okay, thank you. John Romano.
Thanks, Eric. So I think we need to have a time here and here with these things. And I think we need to focus on, so based on Matt's first two presentations, I think the focus needs to be on PRC to just after the 25% design public hearing. I think that's where the biggest bang for our buck is. And we need to figure out what it is that's driving the cost in that segment of the design. I don't know what all the factors are. I bet there's a lot of unknowns, just based on my experience from the community side, having done that for over 20 years. In that segment of the design is where the most unknowns are. That's where the most uncertainty is. That's where we discover the most things. That's where the most scope creep, I bet, happens. We get feedback from the community. We look to try to incorporate things that the community wants. The community identifies issues that we may not have thought about, or identifies things that then creates unknowns that we then need to fund. And then I think last meeting, we also talked about, putting together a checklist to make sure that the number that we assign, the cost that we assign to the project includes, X, Y, and Z, to make sure that the number that we have is the real number that we want, and that, at 100% design, we don't all of a sudden say, oh, you forgot to include the cost for these certain things. We need to have that checklist way at the beginning to make sure that first number or that second number is including those. So I really think that's where the focus is, and that's where we can get the most bang. Because I'm not sure I agree with all of what Jay said, but I do agree with the part that I don't think we can get to a certain part and then all of a sudden we're going to yank somebody off the tip. I just don't think that's going to work. I don't think that's the solution, or rescoring and then saying, all of a sudden your project's not good. I think trying to get to the root of why we get the cost increase and how we're able to either control it or to reduce it is the better way to go about it.
Okay, John, thank you. I appreciate that perspective. I'm going to take people kind of in turn, but then I'd like to kind of come back to the point that John has made and maybe some other points to just kind of get more people's perspective on that. So why don't we go to Ben now?
Sure, thank you, Eric. I just want to note, particularly in the Boston region, a lot of things do come up at that 25% design milestone. There's a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainties. You never know if you're going to dig under the ground and what you're going to find there. There's a lot of sort of accreted history, and we have to recognize that sometimes the best projects just are very expensive. And the TIP process is one of the only means that we have of funding some of these projects. And so, there's going to be some wide variability, I think, and that's something that we need to not necessarily, I don't think we want to be in a position of saying, well, we can't do this particular beneficial regional project because it's too expensive per mile or something to that effect, when there's really no other way to do it, and it is a regional good. So I think any discussion of cost effectiveness needs to consider, what other funding opportunities are available for these types of projects, and whether some of these types of projects, maybe if it's in alignment with MPO long range plan goals, there's kind of a softer discussion of the cost effectiveness. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And then something else I wanted to note is just that funding design brings its own heavy risks. There's elements of, if you use federal funding for design, there's kind of a commitment that something will be built inherent in that. And if something is not built, there's potentially some reimbursement process that has to occur. And I don't think we know what that looks like exactly right now, because we have generally shied away from that for that reason. It also brings additional oversight into the project at an earlier stage. And so, it might end up with the project timeline extending, or with higher costs, or with, there's just risks involved in federally funding design that I think we need to be fully aware of before we start recommending that route.
Thank you. Len Diggins.
Well, to Ben's point, I'd like to understand what those concerns are, what those risks are, because Ken Miller, I'm happy he's here, gave us the distinct impression that, it was something we could do, And so I know just because we can do it doesn't mean that it doesn't have the issues that you brought up, Ben. So I definitely like to hear more about that. And along those lines, I would like to understand more about what would be involved if we did that. Who would do it? And is MassDOT going to do it? And is CTPS staff going to do it, or managing that process? Sorry, I just did that big redundancy. Is CTPS going to do it? But I'm definitely interested in pursuing understanding more about taking on design because design costs, because I also think it's an equity issue, because I think a lot of communities, smaller ones, have problems and difficulties in pulling together the resources to do the design. So I think it would help with respect to that. And I also agree with John Romano, and I think this fits in, Eric, with what you pointed out was a key slide, and that is how we have a lot of projects that are in years 1 and 2 that kind of stay there, especially in year 2, because they're not advancing in the design. And I think if we took control of that part of the process, we would be able to stop that from happening, or at least understand better what's happening. And that is something I want to add to, is I think a benefit from this is that if we did more design, we might understand better what's going on with these projects, and it could help us in terms of selecting projects. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Len. Brian Kane.
Thanks, Eric. I just wanted to echo what Len just said. I do think there's an equity issue around funding design. I guess I do worry, however, that we're going to just have to create another scoring process to figure out which designs we fund. We might just have the same issue all over again in a different way. But I do want to just, again, reiterate that I do not believe we always have to fund 100% or 80% or whatever it is of every project. And I would posit that if there were certain EJ equity projects that the MPO really liked, we could potentially fund the design of those projects, not necessarily everything. And I kind of want to get us to start thinking stop thinking in this binary way where it's either a 1 or a 0. We fund it 100% or we don't. I do think there's nuance, and we can use those dollars in such a way as to promote the projects and the policies that we support, and maybe not necessarily fund everything that we might not love at 100% from an equity perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to go with John and then Matt Peterson after that. John?
Just thanks, Eric. Just real quick, I just want to be clear that I have no position on funding or not funding design. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Matthew.
Yeah, hi, thanks for letting me speak. As I'm a member of the public and a member of the advocacy community, we're really encouraged to hear this discussion. I think this is like a problem that's kind of afflicted the MPO for a long time, and it's really great to hear everyone talking about all these contributions today. Very interested in this tiered approach that Matt Genova presented, both the one mentioned by Virginia DOT, as well as the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the Bay Area. This idea of sorting projects, scoring projects, not like on unit cost alone, like Ben Muller said about being afraid of turning down a bad project because it's got too high of a unit cost per mile, but really looking at this kind of cost benefit sort of, low cost, high benefit, and then high cost, high benefit, low cost, low benefit, looking at the really relation between those two factors, and using that to do some of your scoring and evaluation on an ongoing basis. I think that part of what that can enable is the relation between the MPO and the project component being more of an ongoing relationship and negotiation around project changes and project development over time. And so we'll continue, I will continue following, and the other advocates will also continue following this discussion, but hopefully we may have even more to contribute to this discussion later. But yeah, really excited to hear this conversation today.
Thanks, Matt. I'd like to go back to a point that John Romano made, and I'd like to just get a sense from people. John really said, I think we should focus really in on that sort of PRC to 25%, understand kind of, what are some of the things that drive costs? This was a question that was posed earlier, I think by Brian. Is it scope creep? Is it material, is it materials and time? There was also some questions, that even that Ken Miller raised about kind of different types of projects that we could kind of go into a little deeper there. I think, that could move us towards adopting or thinking about a solution or a policy that is similar to like kind of Cape Cod, where we say we're not going to we're not going to program things, or we're going to require that you have to be at a certain design level based on like year 2 or year 3 or something like that. And I'd just like to hear, like, if folks feel like, is that the direction more we should be going in, or does anyone feel like that's not the direction we should be going in? Jay Monty.
So I think at the root of this is sort of who we assigning the risk to, right? If we're not going to program somebody until 25%, I actually don't disagree with that, but that's a pretty heavy burden on whoever's bringing that project to 25% if they don't get funded, right? If you fund the project up to 25%, but through the MPO, yes, that risk then gets transferred to the MPO or MassDOT. There's always a risk. There's a risk regardless of how we do this. And I think there should be just some discussion about how do we assign that risk? What is the right balance of risk across the different parties?
Right. That's the tension. That's like the heart of the tension about having some type of a harder policy about saying you have to be further advanced in the design process for us to program you on the tip. The interesting thing is what I heard at the Cape Cod Commission was that there was a feeling among like the municipalities, the DPW directors, that like when these projects go up in cost, it's like hurting everybody because of that. And so there's like sort of a shared feeling of like, well, we all are impacted if projects go up in cost and then have to get pushed out, and then there's gaps and there's projects that aren't ready. So I think also like, there probably needs to be some discussion about like, the sort of the risk reward associated with, with that as well. But Jay, yes, I think that's the heart of the tension. Len.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what Jay's coming from. And I want what he wants essentially, but I think your question, Eric, was whether we should study what's causing that increase from PRC to 25%. I think we should, because I think that will give us some insight as to whether that PRC number is correct to start with, so that when we see other PRC numbers based on our study, we can kind of go, well, this isn't going to be realistic with respect to what we're likely to get, at the 25% design phase. So that can, there's a lot of background sound coming from somebody, but
yeah, hold on. Jay, Jay's muted. Thank you, Matt. Archer probably did that.
Thanks. It was just distracting me. I'm sorry. I just losing my train. So I think it's definitely worth studying. And I mean, I'll probably end up still feeling that we'll need to take on some of, if not all of that early design risk, and in order to make things more equitable. I'm just going to toss in one quick thing too. Well, never mind. Actually, I'm going to stay on top. I'm going to stay in scope with your question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So then the other issue, that Jay's raised, and what Len you talked about was now looking at like, the MPO, funding design. That obviously is a whole other, I feel like, can of worms. There's a lot, like, Ben mentioned, there's lots of unintended consequences associated with that. But it sounds like, Jay's certainly interested in pursuing that. I think Len is, Brian voiced potentially, but then he also cautioned that does that change how we do things, and, who's getting design. I think we could bring this back. I guess I'd like to get a sense of, sort of guidance and guidance to staff on this. I mean, just to be 100% honest, we might run into a situation where MassDOT says, yeah, there's no way, where our policy is we don't want to fund design. And I just want to be clear about kind of, where these tensions are. Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to, sort of MassDOT as a whole, how it feels about the MPO funding design. But I will say that, there's a lot of space between what the MPO's current practices are with respect to sort of tracking and following project development and guiding municipalities and funding design for municipalities. And, putting my UPWP chair hat on, that's what the PL funds are for. The TIP is the big tool that the MPO has to affect positive change. And I think making sure that we're dedicating staff time to assist municipalities with project development is something that we can do in the interim, something we can try out for the next year or two, and sort of reorienting staff to provide some of that technical support might be able to lessen some of those gaps that come into play when we're talking about, some municipalities don't have the capacity or the experience to get projects, over the hump or to get people on under contract.
Yeah. I mean, we could have, this body could come up with some short-term recommendations and some longer-term things to follow and consider and reconvene if the problem isn't addressed, over the next couple of years or something like that. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways we could make, recommendations. The other thing, that I've been kind of interested in, but I was actually very interested, Ben, in your perspective on this was incorporating some type of cost benefit into the process. But I'm not getting a sense that there's necessarily a huge amount of enthusiasm for that. I'm sort of feeling that folks are more interested in focusing in on the cost, addressing the cost issues up front, as opposed to putting something on the back end that says, well, when projects do go up in cost, this is the process that we would take for potentially kicking them off the tip. But what I've heard from a number of people is I don't think we're ever going to do that. Len?
Well, I don't know if, the goal is not to kick someone off, but I hear you. I am not opposed, at all to a cost benefit analysis. In fact, I'd like to maybe see what would happen, if we came up with various ways to do that CBA. And I hear Ben's criticism of the notion, and this is what I was going to say earlier. But if we have a project that looks like it's limited in its effect, because of this, kind of like when you just kind of take a basic look at the project, but then you say, but if it affects the whole region, then that becomes the denominator. So I don't see that as a stumbling point, or some reason to not use CBA, because you just didn't say, it's yes, it's cost per mile, perhaps, but the denominator is more than that because of the regional effect. That's it. Thanks. Sorry about the background sound here.
That's okay. What do others feel about, pursuing, incorporating some type of cost benefit? Is it not worth it? Will it become too complex? Jay?
I think Leonard made a good point. I mean, what is the denominator for cost benefit analysis? I don't disagree with doing it. Actually, in some ways favor it, but that's going to be a big sticking point, is what's the denominator? Is it per mile? Is it population? Is it economic benefit? I mean, you could judge it on so many different things, or some combination of things. And much the way we developed, our scoring system, we have 25 different categories. You're going to have the same thing trying to figure out what the denominator is on a cost benefit. So I like the idea. I really do. I just don't know how we really do it in a fair way.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Brian Kane.
I was going to basically say the same thing. How you define what the benefit is and who benefits is the rub. So that's all.
I've been assuming that we would essentially take our existing scoring, and if a project goes up in cost, whatever, we would decide what that trigger would be, whether it's a percent or a dollar amount. We would then rescore the project based on what the change in scope is. So maybe the project might score better because it's added elements to it in our scoring that makes it a better project. And then somehow we then take that score and the cost, and like you're all saying, we divide it by something. And that I think was what we have to like figure out. I would hope that if we did something, it wouldn't be overly complicated. It would sort of be building off of what we're currently doing. But I think, the point that, the points that Ben made about sometimes, there's just really important regional projects and there's not nowhere else to fund them. That resonates with me. And the point that John made about like, if we could really focus in on, the PRC to 25% thing, that might address like a huge part of the problem. That those things, both resonate with me. Len.
Yeah, and we could test. I mean, and if we came up with a algorithm for doing the CBA, I mean, we could back test it and see. I mean, if something important would get dropped. I mean, but as the Transportation for America pointed out, I mean, one way to do it is you take the overall score of the project as we already have, I mean, and use that as your denominator. And because we've gone through this very complex and I think very good way of scoring projects, and so that's encompassing, I mean, of everything. Well, sorry to be redundant again. And I like your idea also, Eric, is that if the costs go up, I mean, if it crosses some trigger, then we rescore. And so let's at least look into it. I wouldn't like dismiss the notion of doing CBA. Certainly not at this stage of the game. Thanks.
Thank you, Len. Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I do think incorporating some cost benefit into the process is beneficial. I think the crux is just whether that's like how that's like at what point in the process that's incorporated, I suppose. Like, is that something that comes in when we do our project scoring when it's at 25%? And if it's there, then we're letting the municipality know, here's how we're evaluating our project. So you should be thinking about your project in this way when you go to that 25% milestone. Like, or is it at the sort of TIP amendment process, at which point it's more of a, as your design progresses, know that we're looking at this continually and there's some sort of unspoken threat there, I suppose, of movement if things don't work out. I think the former, just doing it once at the scoring process introduces the same issue we've seen with other, as the project progresses, we're not rescoring them, we're not moving them around based on that. So if the cost benefit changes dramatically as the project develops, we might miss that. But if we only do it at the amendment process, I think we kind of have recognized that that's a process that typically happens in bulk with the whole TIP being amended at once. And so are we rescoring every project for every TIP amendment? Like, that might be too onerous of a burden to put on staff. So I think that's part of the discussion, is at what point do we apply the cost benefit analysis?
That's a great point. Thank you. And then the other issue that Brian has raised is sort of a slightly, I think of it as a slightly separate issue, but I think one related to this, which is, is there a different way to think about the way that we fund projects to actually try to incentivize or encourage more projects out there? And maybe we don't fund the full, 80% federal piece of it. We fund some, tier of it based on its score, try to leverage more outside, more local dollars or something. I think that's what Brian is trying to get at. Almost like flipping this issue on its head, where projects go up in cost, we do fewer projects. Brian's trying to say, well, what if we actually did something where we were trying to fund more projects and use MPO dollars as sort of an incentive and create more matches? Brian, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's sort of what you're getting at, correct?
Yeah, in a nutshell, Eric. And I guess it's applying, if we could apply our scoring criteria, which is a way in which we apply our policy framework, projects that we want to do, sort of apply that more than once. So you could apply that in terms of funding and in terms of scoring. And I guess, the example is if there's a rail trail project in an incredibly wealthy incredibly white community compared to an EJ project in the inner core, I know where I would like to put our money, but I also know that we don't want to just say no. So, maybe we could figure out a way to apply different weights in terms of funding to different things. So, thank you.
Okay. So what do others, I'd really be interested in what others think of that, because that would be a big change. Ben?
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot today, but I think the only thing I feel about that, I don't have any sort of value judgment one way or the other about whether that's a good approach or not. I will just add that it introduces an additional layer of risk because we can't really advertise a project if it's not fully funded. So when we go to obligate the funds from federal highway, we're required to make sure that every dollar is accounted for the full health of the project. And so if we're putting sort of $1 million towards an $8 million project, then MassDOT's verifying whether the town's got the other 7 million somewhere. And if they don't, but it's too late to fix that, if we're in the summer and it's ready for advertisement, that $1 million just kind of evaporates. So I think there's that risk to keep in mind, but I don't think that's a deal breaker one way or the other. It's just something to keep in mind when we're talking about how much we fund projects.
Yeah, that's a good point. Jay, Monty.
I think when John Bashar was speaking earlier, and he's mentioned this a few times, it almost seems the communities that struggle the most to fund their portion of the project are actually just the smaller communities. It may not necessarily be and I'm going to sound like I'm advocating against ourselves, but it may not necessarily be EJ. It may just be cost per person, right? In a small community, rural community. Not that we have a lot of those in this part of the state, but I think there's just many considerations to think about when we try to decide who funds a proportion of a project. We're fortunate in Everett, by being an EJ community, we can actually afford to do these projects and do quite a bit and fund them. I know that's not everybody, but you could make the argument that there are wealthier communities with smaller populations that would struggle more. And it's not to make a value judgment here, it's just to say that I think there's many factors. So I think that would be a little complicated to work through. I do like Brian's idea. I think it is, will require some thought.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting one. There is, in some ways, our communities with the greatest share of lower income, population tend to be our cities with greater population, and just because of that, they tend to have more resources, where some of our wealthier, very suburban communities, while there's a lot of wealth in those communities, like the municipality isn't necessarily like wealthy and flush with like money to be able to do a lot of things. And so that is an interesting point, Jay. Like we could have a weird thing where it's actually a lot of the smaller suburban communities who might be benefiting from something like this, and just keeping that in, not that there's anything wrong with that, but just keeping that in consideration with how that jives with other kind of policies at the MPO. Len Diggins.
Yes, and also, just keep in mind too that sometimes people are traveling through communities, and so they may not be the demographic in that community, but they will use the bike path in that community to get to some destination that's important to them. So look, I'm all for this. I'm all for exploring various ways of doing things. So I want to support exploring Brian's idea, and I would also suggest that we take on a lot of creative, bold initiatives to explore, and not be so concerned about the timeline of this ad hoc committee. We may have some goals that we may want to accomplish in the near term, but maybe we can ask the board to extend our life so we can explore some of these more creative ideas that are bubbling up. Thanks.
That's a good point, Len. So I'm just noting that we're kind of at a little over 2 hours now, and this has been an incredible discussion. Are there any other points people would like to raise or issues before we sort of start talking, I think, about scheduling next meetings, or other other research areas that you feel like haven't been touched on yet? Tegan.
So I have a question for you all, unless I've missed it in the 2-hour conversation. I feel like one of the options that's fallen off the table, and I want to check whether or not that's intentional, is the idea that you simply make the decision that what you program is what you program, and that you don't increase costs after that money is programmed. And again, I'm not saying I advocate for that. That is a motivation for cost control. And I don't recall it being a key part of this conversation. And again, if you all are not interested, that is fine, but I was checking.
You mean as just a flat out simple solution that says, like, once we program you, that's it, scale your thing back or find more money, or if you can't do those things, you're out. Just
yeah,
like
it avoids rescoring. And I think we had an example of one of the case studies, perhaps, where that was more stringent.
Yeah, I think Ken Miller brought that. It's like a very black and white policy. Yeah. Thank you for raising that. Brian, what do you think?
I guess my only concern is that that also might incentivize municipalities to really jack up the costs up front. And maybe we could just maybe that can get taken care of through the PRC or through the scoring or through whatever MassDOT checks do. But I just have I feel like we're getting inflated prices now, and I'm just afraid that would inflate prices more. But seriously open to considering it. It would make a lot of things a lot easier.
Yeah. Len.
Well, to answer Tegan's question, I mean, it was left off by me, so I was not willing to head down that road. I think the way that I was perhaps going to come at it through the design part of it was to say, if we work with folks to design things, then we would say, look, this is, because we'd have an idea of the funding. We would say, okay, this is what we're going to design up to, and we could even design past that, I would guess, but then say, but this is what we're going to fund. And if you want more, then you need to find the money for it. But the MPO, we designed for this. We'll program this. If you want to do more, it's on you. Thanks.
Yeah, Jim Monty.
I think if we're going to go down that road, we need to know that first number is actually an accurate number. I would make the point that at the PRC level, you're doing a back of the napkin estimate. You're not doing a very comprehensive cost estimate. So I think, while that approach will be simpler, and in an ideal world, I think that might be a good motivation. It doesn't work unless that number is accurate to begin with. I don't think it is today. That's my point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's clear from the presentation today it's not. Ben.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is that a lot of benefit comes from that 25% process and the design public hearing process that really make sure that, before that process is complete, a lot of the design is, within the town administration. And then there's like a little bit of district input, but it's that 25% submission that really gets the project fleshed out. Like, it really identifies what are the natural limits, what are the risks, what are the problems inherent with this project. Will this project not be successful if we don't do the intersection adjacent to it? Some of those key questions really get ferreted out at the 25% design submission. And so, I mean, if we were looking at a cap, I'd point closer to that submission than to the PRC cost. But I think that's, we don't want to miss those project improvements, even though they raise the cost.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my big learning today, like what I learned today was the big increase in cost between PRC and 25% design, and the fact that we program a lot of projects on the tip before the 25% design process, let alone the actual approval of 25% design. To me, that's a huge learning today. It's I think if we could figure out some ways of having picking projects more closer to fully approved at 25% design, I think that would go a long way. I know there's this tension the risk of who sort of bears the risk of advancing that project. I think that's a tension we need to, discuss some more. But that, to me, that's a big learning and takeaway from today. Jay, you had your hand raised.
No, I was just going to echo your exact point, is that I think we are realizing that this 25% mile mark is really probably a better decision point than what we're using today, which is the PRC or earlier. And how, and like you said, how we assign the risk to get to 25%, I think is in my mind the biggest part of the equation. If we take that view that 25% is a better milestone.
John.
Eric, the other approach to this is to say, is it really a cost increase until we get to 25% design? Is 25% design the real number? And we need to not, the same way we include a 4% cost increase for inflation every year, do we have a number that we add to the PRC number? And I know it's going to be an estimate always, right? But is there a number, I don't know, say 20%, just using it for simple math, right? Do we automatically add 20% to each project's PRC number to say, that's the number we're going to start out with for the tip number. And that's what we're going to put into the tip. And then when we get to 25% design, that's the number we're looking at, because we're just kidding ourselves if we think the PRC number is real, because it's not, right? So there's a built-in, we're saying, oh, it's a cost increase. It's really not a cost increase. At 25%, that's when you're getting closer to the real number. And so we're almost measuring a false number. If you think of it. And I mean, maybe false is the wrong word. It's we're using an estimate versus a cost, right? We're getting the real first true cost or sense of a cost after the comments are resolved at 25%. Like Ben says, it's not till after at 25% submission that you sit down with the district and you say, maybe it's supposed to be full depth instead of coplane and overlay. Maybe the other intersection needs to be included. Before, because there are all these reasons. Maybe the town didn't think of that, or whoever was looking at it lightly at the district didn't think of it until that position. So, it's not real till 25%. And so,
right. It's funny.
It's a thought.
The planner in me is already starting to visualize like a matrix with like a bunch of different policy options, like at the beginning and then at the end, like what we could do. I think that's actually kind of what like the staff needs to start working on, thinking about these different ideas. And I think there's like potential kind of solutions that are popping out there, but we need, I think, some more time to kind of chew on this and think about it and work through it. Are there any other topics that folks feel, and Tegan, I appreciate you adding that other sort of, this other one into the mix. Are there any other topics that folks feel like we should either do kind of more like research into, or other potential solutions that we should also be like, putting out there for discussion at upcoming meetings? Ben.
Yeah, I think the only other thing for discussion, since it didn't come up that much today, is trying to figure out some process to engage more closely with district staff, because I think they just have such a deep wealth of knowledge about the projects, and they work very closely with the towns, and so they might have some more insight to add to this process.
Yeah, that's a good one. We could invite folks from District 4 and 3 and 6, to our meetings, or to an upcoming meeting, and get their perspective. Okay, why don't we move along in the agenda? And obviously, if there's something that comes to you, after the meeting, please email staff and say, oh, actually, here's another idea that I'd like to include, in an upcoming meeting or discussion like that. We can always consider that. So the next thing is members items. We always have this. Are there any members items? I don't think so. I don't see any. So let's talk about scheduling the next meeting or meetings. I think we should put at least 3 more on the calendar. And like, 3 that kind of span across like July and August. I got the sense from the last time we talked that people like meeting on Thursdays because those typically are kind of MPO days. We also heard that people feel kind of burned out sometimes when there's like a UPWP meeting and there's an MPO meeting and then there's another meeting. So we were considering July 8th for the next meeting because July 1st is an MPO meeting with a UPWP committee meeting. July 8th would also give staff a little more time, I think, to maybe do some of the research that we've kind of discussed today. What do folks think about July 8th versus July 1st? And please, Matt and others, speak up. July 8th?
I'm good with July 8th.
Okay. July 8th at 10 a.m., a virtual meeting, and, Jay and John and others, right? You can come into feel free to come in. Right, Tegan, the office is open.
Well, I don't know. We have to look at the
okay, sorry.
more recent MassDOT advice to MPOs to hold virtual meetings and what that means. So more to come on that.
Okay. So
and meet out at the Boston Common.
Yeah. So I think we'll do July 8th. Yeah, Len.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, another reason for not doing 3 meetings for me is that I have to work. I'm not getting paid to do this. And I enjoyed it, and so it's not a criticism, but I feel very fortunate to have employment that allows me to spend this much time doing this. So that's why I'm taking so much advantage of the remote meetings because I don't have to commute. So that's why 3 meetings on a day is just really hard for me. So. But I do this all day long if I had my druthers. Thanks.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I hear that. So the next one will be July 8th. Why don't we just go ahead and schedule, I'd like to just schedule 2 more. And if for some reason we don't need them or things happen and we need to change them, but I was thinking the next one would be Thursday, July 29th at 10 a.m. Does that work for people? I know Matt Genova, you said you were going to be on vacation and you'd be coming back on the 28th. So that might be tough, but.
Yeah, it really just depends on, what sort of information folks wanted at that meeting. I could always pull something together before I leave, but yeah, something that's really labor intensive might be tough on that date.
Okay. How long will you be gone?
I'm gone it's like a week and a half leading up to the 29th.
Okay. So you basically have a week so we need to be mindful of that on kind of July 8th, about at least Matt's capacity. But why don't we go ahead and tentatively schedule that? And then I was also thinking August 19th. I know that is probably an MPO meeting, but I don't know if we are going to have any planned ANF or UPWP or any other committee meetings that day. Kate, you know already?
I don't think we have anything for ANF. I'm just going to check with Sandy really fast of when we'll have UPWP.
Which date were we talking about again?
August 19th.
No, we're planning having a UPWP committee on August 5th, assuming nothing goes wrong with the remainder of UPWP development. We're able to get it voted out at the July 1st meeting.
So why don't we go?
I'll be away then, Eric, but you guys can do it without me.
You'll be gone. You won't be able to participate?
I can't say how the internet connection will be where I'm going, but if I can, I will. I don't know if the rental cottage has Wi-Fi.
Okay.
When would you be back, Brian?
Preferably around Labor Day, right after Labor Day. But go ahead, please, and I'll figure it out. I can use my phone if I have to. So
Yeah,
please.
Brian, we can make sure that like all the call stuff if you just want to call in.
That'll
Is
work
that-
for me.
Is that cool though? I mean, you're on vacation. I feel bad if you have to like.
Well, go ahead and schedule it and let me figure that out.
Okay. So why don't we do, just to try to keep momentum, and it might not be that we need it, but why don't we just, we schedule July 8th will be the next one, then the 29th, and then August 19th.
And if we do the 19th, you said that's probably it's likely an MPO day. So want to do it after?
We would do it after, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Any final words? Otherwise, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
Okay. Without objection, we are adjourned. Everyone, thank you so much. This was a great conversation today. I really appreciate it. Look forward to talking again.
You're
Thanks.
welcome.
Thank
I
you.
enjoyed
Thank
it.
you, Matt.
Bye-bye, guys. Take care.